He was about to read words he once wrote on the night he nearly ended his life. On that stage stood Arnold Schwarzenegger, the man who unknowingly saved him. But when the world praises a legacy and forgets the pain behind it, what happens to the man who lit the flame? Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The lights on stage warmed everything they touched. Deep mahogany chairs, polished floors, the rich navy backdrop of the Steve Harvey show. It looked like every other special episode, a celebration, a reunion, a tribute. And tonight's guest was someone you didn't introduce with a resume, you introduced him with reverence. Steve adjusted his lapel, eyes glancing toward the teleprompter, then back at the audience. His trademark grin eased across his face, but it didn't quite reach the eyes, not tonight. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice smooth but slightly lower than usual, "you know him, you've admired him. You've probably quoted him after the gym." The crowd chuckled. He turned toward the guest chair, Mr. Arnold Schwarzenegger. The audience erupted. Cheers, applause, whistles. Arnold stepped out in a charcoal suit, shoulders squared, gait heavy but certain, like he was carrying history on his back and didn't mind the weight. There was a small silver pin on his jacket, not flashy, just present. He greeted Steve with a handshake, then sat down with that same quiet intensity that had made him a force across 3 careers. Steve let the noise simmer, then leaned forward with a smile. "Tonight," he said, "we're here to talk about legacy, about strength, about what it means to be a giant, not just on screen, but in the soul." Arnold smiled, humble. "Thank you, Steve, I'm honored." But Steve didn't continue with his question cards. He looked down at them, tapped them once against his knee, then slid them onto the side table. "Truth is," Steve said slowly, "I had a whole segment planned, couple of laughs, a few how'd you get those arms jokes, but I think I need to say something else." The camera didn't pan, it stayed locked close on his face, because something in his voice shifted. "I've never told this story publicly," Steve said. "Not on this show, not anywhere, but if we're talking legacy, then I have to start here." Arnold turned, listening. Still, Steve took a breath, the kind you take when the memory is still warm in your bones. "Back in 2011, things got dark for me. I'm not talking tired or stressed, I mean dark. The room softened, even the lights felt like they listened. I was going through a divorce, lost a couple shows. Headlines calling me washed up, overexposed, fake." He gave a hollow laugh. "When the noise outside gets loud, sometimes it matches what's already screaming inside." He paused. "I didn't want to die, but I didn't want to breathe either." There it was, the first line that pierced. The audience didn't move. "For 4 days I didn't eat, didn't talk, didn't open the blinds, just sat on my couch feeling like the world had put a period at the end of my story." Arnold's hands had folded on his lap, and for the first time, his thumb gently touched the silver pin on his suit. "Then one night," Steve continued, "I turned on the TV, not looking for hope, just trying to shut out my own thoughts." His voice lowered, "And there you were." Arnold blinked, not out of recognition, out of quiet disbelief. "You were standing on a stage, no lights, no big audience, talking to a bunch of cadets in Virginia. I don't know if it was filmed for anything, but you said." Steve's eyes glistened. "You said, I buried my brother at 18, buried my marriage at 56, buried my dream of being whole again many times. But I learned this, you don't survive grief, you carry it until carrying it becomes strength." A hush spread across the studio like a fog. No one dared disturb. "That line," Steve whispered, "wrapped itself around my chest. I cried harder than I ever have in my life. Not 'cause I was sad, but because, for the first time, someone else said the thing I didn't know how to say." Arnold didn't speak. His eyes didn't flicker, but his grip on that pin, the one he wore for his father, tightened just slightly. "And the next morning," Steve said, voice cracking, "I stood up. I opened the window, I ate a meal. That day didn't fix me, but it saved me." He turned fully now, facing Arnold not as a host to a guest, but as a man to the person who unknowingly handed him back his life. "And I've waited over a decade to tell you, you didn't just inspire me. You rescued me." The room sat in reverent silence. The episode had barely begun, and it had already changed everything. Steve Harvey sat under the soft studio lights, but his mind was already elsewhere, in a place with no lights at all. He didn't glance at the camera, didn't smile, just lowered his head slightly, eyes distant, like he was reading from memory rather than cue cards. It started slow, he said quietly, like exhaustion, the kind sleep doesn't fix. Arnold didn't speak. He simply watched, hands resting still, that silver pin on his chest catching a flicker of light. Steve continued. In 2011, my life cracked in half. My marriage was over, and I wasn't ready. Not emotionally, not spiritually. And the media don't let you grieve. They call it entertainment. He let out a hollow chuckle. I was everywhere. TMZ, gossip blogs, the morning shows, not for my work. Not for my kids, just headlines like Steve Harvey falls apart, Steve's faith tested, has Harvey lost his voice? The audience sat frozen, not because of the story, but because of how different his voice had become, smaller, unguarded. I remember going home after a shoot one day, walking past my own mirror and not recognizing the man in it, he said. That smile I'd worn for 30 years. Gone, not broken, just gone, like it never lived on my face. He turned toward Arnold now, not for permission, but as if bracing himself to go deeper. I spent the next 4 days in silence. No one breathed. I shut every blind in my apartment, turned off my phone, didn't eat. Didn't drink much, didn't cry, just sat on the edge of the bed or the floor. Sometimes I don't even remember where. All I know is I couldn't feel anything. The words didn't rush out. They fell slow, deliberate. My mind wasn't shouting no more. That's the scary part. It got quiet, like a still lake at midnight, and in that quiet I kept hearing one thing. He paused, his voice dropped. You're done. Steve looked down, eyes wet now, over and over. You're done, like God had stamped it on my forehead, and I believed it. I believed that the light I used to carry was just a trick of the stage, that maybe I had faked it so long, I fooled myself into thinking I mattered. Arnold's brow furrowed slightly, not with pity, but recognition. A man listening to pain he'd known too. Steve shook his head slowly. You ever sit in a room full of memories and feel like none of them belong to you anymore? That was me, looking at my Bible, feeling nothing. Looking at pictures of my kids, feeling like they'd be better off with someone else as their father. That's when you know the enemy ain't out there. It's in you. The air shifted. You could hear someone sniff quietly in the crowd. Steve took a shallow breath. I had a thought one night, not loud, just a whisper, said, if you don't wake up tomorrow, maybe that's okay. No one moved. But right when I thought I'd slip into that idea, something in me reached for the remote. A pause. I didn't want to watch anything. I just wanted noise, any noise, and that's when your face came on the screen. He looked up at Arnold. You weren't smiling, you weren't flexing, you weren't the Terminator. You were talking to a bunch of cadets at a military academy. No lights, no crowd applause, just a quiet room and one man speaking from the center of his scars. Arnold's eyes dropped for the first time. His fingers gently touched the silver pin. You talked about burying your brother, Steve said. About divorcing in silence. About standing in the middle of 1,000 cheers and still feeling alone. You said, I don't talk about pain because it's over. I talk about it because it never fully leaves. It just becomes something I walk with. The silence in the studio was no longer out of shock. It was reverence. I remember those words hitting me like a weight I didn't know I needed, Steve continued. Like they gave me permission to not be okay, to stop pretending I was some spiritual superhero. His voice softened. You said the world doesn't care where you fall, but it remembers where you rise. And I don't know why, but that sentence, Arnold, it made me open the blinds the next morning. A long pause. I saw the sun, just light on the wall, and I wept, not because I was healed, but because I realized I still wanted to be here, not for fame, not for redemption, just to be. Arnold sat still, but something had changed in him too. His posture, less armor now, more acknowledgement, like hearing his own story told back to him through someone else's wounds. Steve wiped his eyes, and I didn't fix everything that day. I still lost things, still stumbled. But that clip, that moment, It planted something in me that I've carried ever since." He smiled now, a different smile, one earned. "You didn't just give a speech that night, Arnold. You passed the torch without knowing it to someone in the dark, who needed that fire more than you could imagine." Arnold's lips pressed together. His hand didn't leave the pin on his chest. The audience remained in stillness, because what had just happened wasn't entertainment. It was a man returning to the moment he almost didn't make it, and honoring the stranger who unknowingly walked him home. Steve sat upright now, not out of pride, but out of clarity. His voice, though calm, carried the charge of someone opening a sealed door inside himself. "It wasn't just what you said, Arnold," he began. "It was how you said it." He looked directly at him. "You weren't selling inspiration. You weren't wrapping pain in pretty words. You were standing there like a man who had bled, and you weren't hiding the stains." The studio was silent. You could hear the breath of the boom mic shift when someone exhaled too hard in the audience. "I didn't know where that speech came from," Steve continued. "Didn't know if it was public or private, but I remember the room you were in, cadets in uniform, a small American flag off to the side. You didn't have notes. You didn't need them." Arnold nodded slightly, eyes fixed on Steve, as if reliving the night himself. "You started with something none of us expected," Steve said. "You said, 'Before I became anyone you know, I was a teenage boy hiding in a barn, praying my father wouldn't see me cry.'" That sentence dropped into the room like a stone in a quiet lake. Steve paused, letting the weight sit. "You said he was a war veteran, that he believed tears were a weakness, that he never spoke of fear, only of duty." Arnold's jaw tightened slightly. The silver pin on his jacket glinted once more under the lights. "You told those cadets that your strength wasn't built in the gym, it was built in silence, in holding things you weren't allowed to name." Steve glanced at the audience now, not to perform, but to invite them in. "And then," he continued, "you said, 'I built a body the world admired, but inside I stayed 12 years old, carrying my brother's death like a weight I couldn't drop.'" A few heads lowered. Someone in the crowd whispered, "Jesus." Steve turned back. "That's when I stopped being a viewer, I became a witness." Arnold's hands folded steady. "You spoke about your divorce," Steve said, voice softer now. "You didn't use blame or drama, just honesty." "I failed my family in ways muscle can't fix," you said. "And when the cameras went away, I sat alone in rooms too big for forgiveness." It wasn't just the words. It was the tone that rippled through the room, the kind of tone that lives only in those who have been to the edge and turned back. "You told them about success," Steve said, "but not the kind people clap for." You said, "Success is waking up the day after humiliation and deciding to try again anyway, not to prove the world wrong, but to prove your spirit survived." The lights didn't move, the camera didn't cut, because nothing else in that studio needed to speak. "I remember you looked out at those cadets," Steve said, "and your voice got quieter. You said, 'Some of you will bury friends. Some of you will come home to silence. Some of you will break in places no doctor can treat. And when that day comes, I need you to remember, you're not broken. You're becoming the shape of someone stronger.'" A woman in the third row covered her mouth. Steve didn't glance. He was still speaking into the memory. That was when I started crying," Steve admitted, "not because I was sad, but because no one had ever described my pain so precisely. I didn't know how to explain what I felt until you gave it shape." Arnold blinked slowly. The room held its breath with him. "And then," Steve continued, "you ended the speech with something I've carried like armor." He sat forward slightly, elbows on knees. "You said, 'I've played heroes, but I've also been the villain in people's lives. I've built greatness and I've destroyed things I loved, but I kept walking, because even when I didn't believe in myself, someone else did. And now I speak in case you're the one who needs to hear it tonight." Steve's voice faltered. "You were talking to those cadets, Arnold, but you were also talking to me, sitting on a couch, in the dark, on the edge." Arnold didn't reply. He only looked at him, the lines around his eyes deeper now, not aged, worn with meaning. "I watched that clip again the next morning," Steve said, "and again the next week. And then I started sharing it with people I knew were hurting, people who were trying to hold up entire worlds with cracked backs and brittle hearts. His eyes scanned the studio, and I know I'm not the only one. He nodded once, as if cueing something unseen. Cause I got messages, emails, calls, from people I'd forgotten I sent it to, and they all said the same thing. I thought I was alone, but that man, that voice, it reached me. Steve turned to Arnold once more, quieter now. I don't think you know what you did that night. I don't think you ever will. But I'm here to say you spoke like you'd been there, and because of that, so many of us came back. Steve let the silence breathe. He'd said what he came to say, but the moment hadn't settled. It was still expanding, like something too sacred to contain in words alone. Arnold sat still. His face didn't shift, but something in his presence had. The silver pin on his chest, that quiet symbol, caught a different kind of light now. Not studio light, the light of being seen. Steve exhaled slowly, then gently. I thought that was the end of it. The audience leaned in. Even the ones who had already wiped away tears, they knew something else was coming. Steve nodded to himself. I figured you saved me, and that was enough. But a few months later, I met a young woman, flight attendant, maybe 24, came up to me after a show, said, Mr. Harvey, I just want to thank you for sending me that video. He paused. I didn't know what she was talking about. Arnold tilted his head slightly, not in confusion, but anticipation. Steve continued, his voice lower. Turns out I'd shared that clip with her aunt months earlier. Her aunt lost her husband to cancer. Wasn't eating, wasn't speaking, thought God forgot her. He looked over at Arnold, but when she watched you speak, something shifted. She didn't get over her pain, but she started living again, and she passed that video to her niece, and her niece passed it on to someone else. And now, Steve gave a breath of awe. I've lost count of how many people have told me that video stopped them from giving up. Arnold's lips parted just slightly, his eyes didn't move, but the weight behind them had grown. Steve folded his hands. His tone was quiet, but firm, a man stepping into a responsibility he never asked for, but now owned. I used to think healing was a private thing, he said. You suffer, you survive, and you try to move on. But I learned something different. He leaned forward. Sometimes the moment that breaks you becomes the moment that saves someone else, but only if you name it, only if you share it. Arnold blinked, slowly. Steve's gaze didn't waver. That speech you gave, that wasn't just a moment of honesty, that was a blueprint for survival. He let the words land, then added, and I wasn't the only one who needed it. Another pause, deliberate, heavy. Steve looked out across the studio. There was a mother in Georgia, lost her son to gun violence, didn't speak for weeks. Her sister sent her that clip. Now she runs a youth center in his name. He looked back at Arnold. There was a veteran in Oklahoma, sleeping in his truck, thought about ending it every morning. He watched your speech on a stranger's phone at a rest stop, said your words were the reason he got help. Arnold's hands shifted now. Not restlessly, reverently. He clasped them tighter, like holding something sacred between them. Steve leaned in again. You weren't just talking to cadets that night. You were talking to everyone who ever thought the pain they carried made them weak. You showed us that scars ain't shameful. They're proof we made it through. The audience stirred, quiet sniffles, a few bowed heads. One woman clutched her chest. Steve's voice dropped lower, more intimate. Arnold, you gave me something that night. But what I didn't realize, not until now, is that you gave me something to pass on. He nodded once, a flame. The word echoed not loudly, but with quiet finality. Arnold finally spoke, not much, just a whisper. I never knew. Steve smiled, soft, sorrowful, grateful. That's the thing about light. You don't always know who's walking in your glow. Arnold looked down for a moment. Then his hand moved, instinctively, to the pin on his chest. His fingers rested there gently, like remembering something older than words. Steve saw it, and he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The camera didn't pan. The music didn't swell. The moment stood still, because this wasn't about fanfare. This was a man realizing that the darkest chapter of his life had become a lantern in someone else's. And another man, the one who lit it, just beginning to understand the weight of that flame. The applause didn't come. Not because the audience wasn't moved, but because silence felt more sacred. Steve sat back in his chair, the air around him still heavy with what had just been said. Arnold remained silent, hand resting gently on the pin over his chest. But something in his expression had shifted, not pride, not disbelief, something closer to quiet responsibility. Steve looked across the room, then turned to the crew. "I need one more chair," he said softly. A producer nodded. A third chair was brought out. No one in the audience knew what was coming, not even Arnold. Steve spoke again, his voice lower now. "You saved me, Arnold. You saved people you've never met. But there's one more life your words changed, in ways I don't think even you could imagine." From backstage, a woman stepped forward. She was in her 30s, olive skin, steady eyes, and a posture that carried both authority and humility. A long, tailored coat fell past her knees, and in her hands was a worn black notebook. The camera pulled wide as she walked toward the stage. Steve smiled gently. "Arnold, this is Congresswoman Clara Gutierrez." The room shifted. A wave of surprise moved through the crowd. Arnold stood up as she approached, offering his hand. She didn't just shake it, she held it. "I've waited 12 years to do that," Clara said quietly. She sat down between them. Her eyes were bright, but not from nerves, from memory. "I was 22 when I saw that speech," she said. "Just lost my campaign, lost my savings, pregnant, alone. The press called me naive, reckless, unfit. I called myself worse." Her hands tightened around the notebook. "I sat on the floor of a friend's apartment in El Paso, trying to figure out if I was going to keep going. Then Steve sent me a clip. He didn't say much, just wrote, 'This saved me once. Maybe it can help you too.'" Arnold watched her motionless. She looked at him now. "That night, you told a room of cadets that survival wasn't strength, that continuing anyway was." Her voice thickened. "I watched you say, 'The world remembers where you rise.' And I decided that night I wasn't done." The audience was frozen. This wasn't a testimonial. It was a turning point. Clara opened the notebook slowly, revealing pages covered in scribbled names, bullet points, ideas, some marked out, others circled. "This," she said, "became the second light." Steve nodded. "Tell them what that is." Clara looked toward the audience, then back at Arnold. "It's a program, national now, started in Texas. We take in youth who have been expelled, incarcerated, written off. Kids who have heard 'you're done' more times than their own names. We teach them discipline, purpose, dignity, not through pity, through rebuilding." She turned the notebook around, showed Arnold a list of names. "These are the first 20 who graduated. All of them watched your speech the first week of intake." Arnold stared at the names, then at Clara. She continued. "We played it on day one. I told them, this man failed, this man lost, this man walked through shame, and he still showed up. So will you." Her eyes began to shine. "You didn't just save me, Arnold. You lit a fire I couldn't put out. That flame, it's burning now in 12 states." She reached into her coat, pulled out a small patch, a navy circle with gold embroidery. In the center, a torch. "This is the emblem of the program. They chose it. They call it the second light. Because the first one went out. But this one's theirs to carry." She held it out. Arnold didn't take it right away. His hand hovered, as if touching it would make all of this real. Then he took it, gently, reverently. Like holding a piece of something holy. The room didn't move, because they all understood this wasn't about charity. It wasn't about politics. It was about a man who bled quietly and unknowingly gave a generation the blueprint to rise. Arnold didn't speak at first. He held the patch in both hands, the golden torch resting against his palm like a question he hadn't expected to be asked. For a long moment, he stared at it, not blinking, not moving, just letting the weight of what it represented settle into him. No one in the studio dared to interrupt. Not Steve, not Clara, not even the audience, who were now more witnesses than viewers. Arnold finally looked up. His voice was quiet. German accent softened by emotion, each word deliberate. "I wore this pin," he said, touching the small silver medal on his chest, "for my father. He gave it to me before I left Austria. Said, 'Remember who you are when the lights are gone.'" He exhaled, "But I didn't know that people would look at me the same way I looked at him." He turned to Clara. you built something from my words, you gave them a home, a future. Then to Steve, you gave those words life again, shared them when I'd almost forgotten I said them. His fingers found the edge of the pin. For years, it had been there, quiet, symbolic, rarely noticed. But now it felt louder than anything he'd ever said. I thought I wore this because I survived, he continued. But maybe I wore it because I owed something. The studio was still. You could hear a breath catch in someone's throat. Arnold's hands moved. Slowly, he unpinned the medal from his jacket, not theatrically, almost reluctantly, like it had been fused to his identity. He looked down at it, then reached out and placed it gently in Clara's open palm. Her eyes widened, but she didn't speak. Arnold said, "My father gave this to me to carry something forward. I think today it has found where it belongs next." He sat back. It was not a grand gesture. It was something far rarer. A man giving away part of himself without needing credit, applause, or return. Clara clutched the pin in both hands, overwhelmed. Steve's eyes welled again, not from sadness, but awe. "You've carried a lot, Arnold," he said, voice rough. "Most people don't realize how heavy it is to inspire quietly." Arnold nodded once. "The hardest part isn't the weight," he said. "It's not knowing who you're carrying it for." The words landed like a final note in a symphony, clear, deep, lasting. Clara slowly stood, holding both the patch and the pin, the torch and the medal, the new flame and the old weight. And in that stillness, something passed between generations, something no camera could fully capture. A man who once stood alone in silence, now surrounded by lives he helped save without knowing. And a new flame, lit from a hidden one, now ready to light others. Steve stood up. He didn't make a speech, didn't crack a joke. He just rose to his feet, like something within him had shifted into place, something sacred, something earned. He looked out across the audience. Some were crying, some had their heads bowed, but all were standing silently, as if they understood they weren't just watching a story, they were becoming part of it. Steve turned to Arnold. "You gave us something," he said quietly. "Not just a speech, not just strength, you gave us permission." Arnold lifted his eyes. "Permission." Steve nodded. "To fall, to hurt, to admit we broke, and still to rise, not polished. Not perfect, just willing." He turned to Clara, then back to the crowd. His voice remained low, not a rally, but a call. "There are people out there right now, maybe watching this from a hospital room, or a shelter, or their car. And they think it's over." He paused. "But I'm here to tell you, if you're still breathing, then you're not done." Clara stepped forward, holding the patch and the medal, the torch and the legacy. She looked out toward the audience, her voice steady but full. "The world doesn't change because of speeches," she said. "It changes when people like you carry the light you've been given and pass it on." She turned to Arnold. "You carried it longer than anyone knew, and now we will too." Arnold didn't respond with words. He stepped forward and simply placed his hand over hers, covering the torch and the medal in her grip. Then he turned to Steve. The two men stood in stillness, the kind that only comes from understanding forged in pain. Steve looked at the audience one last time. "If you've ever felt like you were too late, too broken, too small to matter, hear me," he said. "Your story doesn't end with silence. It begins with sharing it. That's how the fire spreads." No applause came. Instead, the crowd slowly, quietly began to rise row by row. No cheering, no music. Just the sound of hearts rising in unison. A moment passed, then another. Then Steve reached out, not for a handshake, but for an embrace. And Arnold, the man who once stood alone behind a wall of strength, stepped into it. Two men, both scarred in different ways, now standing as proof that broken does not mean defeated. Clara stepped beside them. No spotlight was needed. The light came from within the moment. 3 lives, 3 burdens, 1 flame. And in the hush of the studio, something passed through every soul standing, a quiet vow, to carry what they've been given, to speak when silence tempts them, to rise not because they're unbroken, but because they're willing to walk with the weight. The screen faded to black, but the flame remained.